You are listening to programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Good morning to all of you here, and warm greetings to everyone in other time zones around the world, especially the Philippines. We're very happy to have you here on a very important subject. But before we get started on the topic, I want to express on behalf of the East-West Center our profound and heartfelt thanks for two initiatives that are very important for the U.S. relationship with the Philippines. The first is we've established a U.S. Philippine Alliance Fellowship Program, and Mr. Acosta on my left is one of the first beneficiaries of this opportunity to come to Washington for several months with support from the East-West Center Washington, and to hopefully deepen his or her understanding of the United States attitudes. And the second is part of our Asia Matters for America series. I hope you're all familiar with that. We have, in some cases like ASEAN, included multiple countries. In other cases, it's individual countries. And I'm happy to say that there is now a version called The Philippines Matters for America, with lots and lots of good data in it. Not just trade and investment, not even just security, but things like foreign students and other sister cities, other kinds of data. So I urge you to take a look at that. It's somewhat timely, to put it mildly, to look again at the visiting fellow, visiting forces agreement, not the visiting fellowship, the visiting forces agreement, and that's what we'll be doing in just a moment. We have two people who could not be better qualified to take on this particular issue. Mr. Renato Acosta on my immediate left, or known as Rene Acosta, is a author, editor, journalist.
Yes.
For more than 30 years. And he has published very widely in a number of publications. He also is a full-time reporter for a publication in the Philippines called Business Mirror. And in that capacity, he follows defense, national security issues. The next person to his left is well known to many of you. It's Ambassador Thomas Hubbard, who served as ambassador to the Philippines from 1996 to 2000, and he is currently, he at one point was Philippines desk officer in state, so he's been immersed in the Philippines for different parts of his career. He's currently the head of the Korea Society in New York and is on any number of advisory boards. If you want more biographical information, this was passed out this morning, and there's also lots of material on our website. So with that, I think we'll get started. We'll first ask Mr. Acosta to make a presentation, which is part of the requirement for the fellowship here. And after that, we'll hear from Ambassador Hubbard, and then it will be an open discussion, and I hope all of you raise questions or comments. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Acosta.
Thank you. Please allow me to read my prepared statement about my research. Former U.S. Ambassador to the Philippines and current Senior Director of the McClarty Associates, Thomas Hubbard. Senior Advisor and East-West Center Fellow, Dr. Ellen Cross, who is also the moderator for today's event. Visiting Fellow, Dr. Nasiruddin from Chittagong University of Bangladesh. Other East-West Center staff, guests, and to all those who are following us right now via the internet, because I understand that this is also being streamed live. Good morning. The Philippines is currently beset by security challenges, both internally and externally. Internally, it is dealing with a communist-spawned insurgency and un-Islamic militancy-born terrorism. Externally, it is coping with territorial threats associated with its maritime waters in the West Philippine Sea and in the Kalayaan Island Group, which is part of the Philippine province of Palawan. and this was mainly due to China's pending claims, which it has been pursuing aggressively. In both internal and territorial challenges, the United States of America is there for the Philippines, being its treaty ally and partner in a number of other security agreements. In February 2020, the administration of then former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte moved for the abrogation of the Visiting Forces Agreement, or VFA, one of the Philippines' existing security agreements with the United States. More than a year later, or in July 2021, Duterte recalled the termination of the VFA and reinstituted it in full after a meeting with U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin III in Manila. Since my research is entitled The Visiting Forces Agreement, its effects on Philippine security and stability in Southeast Asia, I am sure that most of you will say the topic is already a history, an afterthought, but it is not. It remains relevant, and it will remain relevant even in the future due to the existence of the U.S. Philippine military alliance and the unstable security in the Indo-Pacific region. Also, let me state that this research topic was submitted in 2019, while the scuttling of the BFA is hanging in the balance, but my residency with the East-West Center was delayed for 2 years because of the COVID-19 pandemic. In moving to terminate the BFA with the U.S., Duterte grandstanded with the U.S. over its decision to deny the renewal of the U.S. visa of his former top police chief, General Ronald De La Rosa, who is now a Philippine senator. Also, the Duterte administration wanted the U.S. to pay more money for its presence in the Philippines by way of the BFA. This despite the billions of pesos in aid and assistance, aside from training, that the U.S. had been according to the Philippines yearly. The reasons given were very parochial. Aside from the fact that it glossed over the amount of money and other benefits that the Philippines has been receiving from its treaty partner and ally, experts from the security and diplomatic sectors, however, believe that Duterte's decision in moving to end the security agreement still form part of his continuing effort during his administration to tilt the Philippines over to China. The former president has not kept secret his affection and admiration for China and has trumpeted his friendship with President Xi Jinping and other Chinese officials. So, what are the possibilities and implications had the BFA been terminated? The points laid out here could also serve as a reference in the future should a Duterte-like leader arise out of the alliance in the years to come. Based on my research, there are a number of major reasons. One, given the absence of the U.S. forces in the Philippines, this will further embolden China to creep deeper into the territory and maritime waters of the Philippines, still under its 9 DAS line claims that has been rejected by the UN Permanent Court of Arbitration in its 2016 decision, but which Beijing refuses to acknowledge. The BFA, which was signed in 1988, governs the presence and activities of American troops in the Philippines, and it supports the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, that was also signed by the Philippines with the U.S. in 2014. The EDCA allows the prepositioning of U.S. forces and their assets in selected military camps in the Philippines. With the 9-line claims, China is already present in the West Philippine Sea and Kalayaan Island Group, which prompted the defeatist Duterte to even declare during his presidency that China is already in possession and physical control of the two territories because of its unchallenged presence there. Without U.S. forces in the Philippines, China could intrude into the Philippine strategic waters of Ilocos Norte and Batanes in northern Luzon, and move further closer to Palawan. It would not also be stopped from developing the Scarborough Shoal near Batsambales in central Luzon into a military base as it now occupies the shoal. Excuse me. If all this happens, it could now easily strike any part of the Philippines in the event of a war. Without the BFA, and as such, the absence of U.S. troops in the Philippines, the U.S. cannot readily respond and help the Philippines if it is attacked, especially in the South China Sea. Knowing that it could not militarily assist the Philippines, despite its legal obligation to do so under the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty, then the U.S. would not be precluded from scrapping the treaty, instead of allowing its credibility to suffer as a treaty partner and the world's foremost military power. Second reason, the scuttling of the BFA will affect the political, economic, diplomatic, and military relations of the Philippines, and as a consequence, it will lose the benefits, including funding and assistance, training, and military modernization aid that it is now getting as a treaty partner and ally. The Philippines got $267.75 million in military financing and defense equipment from 2016 to 2016 up to 2019, and another $45 million in foreign military financing from 2020 up to 2021. From the U.S., it was also granted $200 million for aircraft, training, equipment, and construction for the military. Likewise, the country has received at least $336.30 million worth of development assistance, and all this happened under Duterte, who has a frosty relations with the U.S. On a bigger and wider scope, the absence of U.S. forces in the Philippines will deny the U.S. of a forward presence in Southeast Asia, and as such, it will leave the status quo in the region to exploit and abuse by China, given that its 9-line claims also intrude into the maritime waters of Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The world's freedom to overflight and even navigate the regional waters, especially the South China Sea, where trillions worth of trade passes annually, is truncated. Given China's claims of more than 75% of the whole of South China Sea, where it has already built military bases in at least 7 features. Also, Taiwan will not be assured quick military aid and support from the U.S. if it is attacked by China. Taiwan is just separated by the Bashit Channel from the province of Batanes in the Philippines. Under EDCA, the Philippine province of Cagayan which borders Batanes, has been proposed to also host the rotating U.S. forces. By being present in Cagayan and even Zambales, which is another proposed site of the EDCA, the U.S. can watch over the Basi Channel, which China will cross into the Pacific Ocean to attack by sea the U.S. bases in Guam and Hawaii. Thank you, and again, a pleasant morning to all.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Acosta. A very powerful presentation. Over to you, Ambassador Hubbard, intimately involved in this subject.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Renee, for your excellent presentation. A lot of time has passed since you were initially asked to examine the subject of the VFA. At the time, President Duterte was threatening or promising to revoke the agreement. I'm pleased that the new President Marcos has been much more. One, Duterte decided that it wasn't in the Philippine interest to actually abrogate the agreement. I think he was persuaded of that by a number of people, including the Philippine Defense Establishment, which very much wanted to keep the agreement alive, as well as the Philippine diplomatic establishment, which saw this visiting forces as an important agreement, as an important symbol of the U.S. presence in the Philippines and the region, and a signal to China, which has been increasingly aggressive in the area. That might be useful to go back a little bit in history because actually the VFA, the Visiting Forces Agreement, was signed during my time as an ambassador in the Philippines, and I don't think I'm being immodest to say that it was really my idea because it addressed a need that we found during that period, just after my arrival in the Philippines ambassador. I was in the Philippines twice, from the 1990 to 1993 as number 2 in the embassy deputy chief of mission, and later as ambassador from 96 to 2000. I go back to my earlier period as deputy chief of mission because we were then in the midst of a renegotiation of the military bases agreement, which we had in the Philippines since 1947, which provided the backdrop and the foundation for our military bases in the Philippines. Sort of a Cold War relic, but very important at the time. We had 2 of our largest military bases in the world at the Clark Air Base and the Subic Naval Base, and we maintained that since '47 on sort of the basis of 10-year agreements, and we came up. That agreement was up for renewal in 1992, and so immediately after my arrival, I was deeply involved with negotiations to try to renew that basis agreement. And over time, with some difficulty, we succeeded in signing an agreement with the Cory Aquino administration of the Philippines to renew the military bases agreement. But for a variety of reasons, that agreement was voted down by the Philippine Senate, which failed to achieve the 2/3 majority that needed for ratification of the treaty. And so we withdrew our forces from the Philippines in 1992. I have on my wall in my office here a photograph given to me by our embassy staff of the U.S. Navy ship leaving Subic Bay for the last time under the the military bases agreement. It's a reminder to me, one, that we respect our allies, we respect democracy. The democratic process in the Philippines led to a Senate decision that I think was a mistake, but is a fact of life and one that we accepted as a democracy. So in 1992, we found ourselves without a mechanism without an agreement covering our military bases, our military presence, the presence of our forces in the Philippines. But we look back and fairly quickly realized that we no longer were able to have bases in the Philippines, but we were still treaty allies under our mutual defense treaty of 1951. The bases agreement preceded the actual alliance. Procedures for our military personnel visiting or traveling or even exercising with Philippine forces were kind of all attached to the bases agreement instead of to the alliance itself. And so we found ourselves in 92 with an alliance, but no procedures for actually implementing the alliance through the military interaction, exercises, ship visits, even occasional presence that we would normally have with an alliance. That alliance is a very precious document. We no longer do mutual defense treaties. This is something we did immediately after World War II. In Asia, we really have I guess 5 treaty alliances with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, and Australia, New Zealand, and with Thailand as a relic of the former CETO arrangement. Most of those agreements do involve the presence, the physical presence of forces in the country. We took a look at it strategically and realized we really liked those bases in the Philippines. They were good for training, for exercise, for transit of military personnel. They were good for ship visits. A very large proportion of the sailors on U.S. Navy ships actually are ethnically Filipino and very much like those visits. But we needed some sort of basis for them, not bases, but a basis for them to a foundation for these activities. And we tried various sort of forms of kind of diplomatic coverage for our personnel coming in, various other agreements. But finally, when I arrived, shortly after I arrived in the Philippines as ambassador in 1996, I was informed that those arrangements probably never had been valid and certainly were no longer valid, that we no longer had any sort of procedures covering our visits to the Philippines for training and other exercises. So that led me to say, what we really need in the Philippines is the kind of thing we have with our other treaty alliances and even some partners. We need status of forces arrangements. The term status of forces carried a lot of historic baggage, implying some extraterritoriality and all of that. And as we got into, I came back to Washington, persuaded the Defense Department that we should try to get that. It was even more important that we'd be doing these exercises there in the mid-90s after the Chinese had become much more aggressive in the South China Sea. So we needed some basis for that, and let's try to get a status of forces agreement. And as we worked our way through that agreement, we discovered that nomenclature was one problem. What do you call this agreement that provides for our physical presence, et cetera? And I think also I can claim credit for coming up with the idea of calling it a visiting forces agreement, because that's what we wanted. We wanted our forces to be able to visit the Philippines for various exercises, ship visits, and all of that. We were not seeking a permanent presence in the Philippines. But I do think it's worth looking back to that time. And you know, in 1992, when we accepted the Philippine Senate decision and the government's decision that we had to pull out our forces, China was just beginning to become powerful in the region, just beginning to show some of its ambition. You know, we knew that the islands in the South China Sea, or fixtures in the South China Sea, were controversial. We weren't really expecting the Chinese to do what they have actually done, which is not only to claim those islands contrary to UN judgments, or fixtures contrary to UN judgments, but actually to militarize them with you know, military capable air bases, etc., with quasi-naval forces there, with their fishing vessels, etc. It's worth wondering, you know, if we had perhaps been more foresighted in 1992, would the Chinese have been as aggressive as they have been over the ensuing decades in trying to enhance their presence in the South China Sea, if the U.S. forces had still maintained their permanent presence in the Philippines? We know that the Visiting Forces Agreement was not enough to deter the Chinese, because beginning in about about 1995, they began, you know, sort of laying physical claim to various features. But you know, we have hit a point now where again a U.S. presence in that area is important, and I'm very pleased that President Duterte did not succeed in abrogating the Visiting Forces Agreement, that it is still valid. But getting back to the beginning, what that agreement is really became, it has, I guess, both practical and symbolic value. The practical value is it contains all of the procedures for U.S. forces to enter the Philippines. If you think about an aircraft carrier that has 6,000 or 7,000 people on it, and they want to come ashore, you know, during ship visits, how do you process the, you know, what are normally visas and things like that? We need an agreement like that. I think the part of the Visiting Forces Agreement that has become has been controversial in the Philippines is similar to the parts of the status of forces agreements that we have around the world and around the region, is sort of the special treatment that they carry for our forces. You know, they don't have to have visas. They, like other international travelers might, not Americans necessarily. You know, they have to. Each of these agreements carries provisions that say that when U.S. military personnel misbehave or commit a crime, etc., in their host countries, if they are on duty, we handle any prosecutorial activities, any disciplinary actions. If you have an accident on duty, that really is up to the United States to take care of. And sometimes the question of what constitutes duty is another thing. But they also provide that in most cases, even when the personnel are not on duty, U.S. will request, and the other side will normally grant the ability for the U.S. to actually carry out that trial. In the case of the Philippines, there was a case of a murder where we requested that he be turned over to us for prosecution. The Philippines exercised their right to deny that permission, they did try the individual. We also had some special provisions for where he would be held in prison, et cetera. I forget some of the details, but he was actually imprisoned in the Philippines for about 10 years, both partly on the premise of the U.S. Embassy and partly in a special place that for Americans under this status to be imprisoned in the Philippines. And that kind of becomes controversial, and that was one of the excuses I think that Duterte used in trying to abrogate the agreement. We did work through that, and we now have new procedures that I think both sides can appreciate. The need for the visiting forces agreement, I think even personally, I believe that the need for us to have some protection over our military personnel sent there is fairly clear, and we have those same protections. I've had the honor of helping uphold our military arrangements, including status of forces in Korea, where I was ambassador, after the Philippines and Japan, where I spent about half my career, and even in Malaysia, where we have some informal arrangements. So this is not something unique to the Philippines, but it is important if we're going to continue to have our presence in the area, and that presence, the need for that presence is even more apparent now than it has been in a very long time. And I think the Philippines is more important, both in an operational sense and a symbolic sense, to the United States and to both countries than it has been for a long time. Let me briefly mention also which Renee mentioned, the subsequent, the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which does provide for U.S. to build some of its own facilities inside Philippine military facilities around in strategic places around the country. Again, our forces will only be visiting on rotation, but they will have under this agreement. They'll be able to stockpile material and operational capabilities that could be needed. And again, this is based on the Visiting Forces Agreement, which provides for visiting forces, not for permanent forces present in the Philippines, which would require amendment of the Philippine Constitution, among other things. So finally, I think it is a good thing that, Renee, you came here to talk about our success in maintaining the agreement, the importance of the agreement to the Philippines. I personally consider it important for the United States, and I'm open to. I'm happy to be here as one of the kind of the father of the VFA. I continue to be proud of that, and I'm open to any questions.
Well, that's just terrific. Before I open it up, I'm going to seize the privilege of the chair and ask you both some questions. And meanwhile, I encourage all of you to participate, and anyone who's tuning in visually can also post questions and comments. Tom, you're absolutely right about the VFA. It has your name engraved on every page. What I'm wondering is whether both of you really could say something about the sort of the broad political economy of the controversy. For example, the Philippines is a very diverse country with Luzon here and Mindanao down there with different religions and cultures and so on. Where did the opposition to VFA come from? Was it presumably the Philippine military supported the closer relations with the U.S.? So is it Duterte's nationalism? Is it young people who think the United States is too aggressive? I mean, can you talk a little bit about the political context that you observed as you went through?
I think
Over to you, yeah.
Well, I think the the opposition to these things is only coming from, I think, even the former ambassador knows it, from the leftist group,
Okay.
of course, because as I said, we have a long-standing, we have a long-running communist insurgency, which is being moved by the NPA and the Communist Party of the Philippines. And of course, when you talk of communism or communists, they always anti-Americans. Then secondly, I think the majority of Filipinos support basically this agreement and even the close relations with the U.S. The only thing is, of course, the commander-in-chief. The president is, tilting towards the other country. Tilting to China. Supposedly, as he pursued another, facet of independent foreign policy under his administration. He's trading the sea from the U.S. to China. But when it comes to the political support from the ground, I think there's none. The only thing that's propping up Duterte, the former president, is, the troll. That's the problem right now. We have been so infested by a troll, promoting president and everything. So that's one reason. When it comes to the military, of course, the military is always dependent on the U.S. When you talk of the Philippine military, you always talk about U.S. also, because basically all the equipment, training and everything comes from the U.S. So they support the relations with the U.S., the military agreement and everything. But then, of course, the commander-in-chief, who is the president himself, was tilting towards China. They cannot say anything. It's good that even if the president presses the Philippines towards China, the majority of Filipinos and even the military still maintains the posture, the focus towards the Americans and their allies. That's basically what's there.
Yeah, again, I might even go back to history a bit. I think we estimated back in '92 when the Aquino government signed the renewed bases agreement with us, and the Philippine Senate rejected it. We estimated that 80% or more of the Philippine public actually supported the relationship with the United States and actually supported that agreement. It was an action taken by, insulting a rogue Senate, which was, I think, sort of elected in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the first Marcos administration and the democracy movement that led to Cory Aquino's ascension to the presidency. I think she needed a lot of persuasion that this was good for the Philippines, but very clearly made that decision. I think one of the reasons the bases were popular is they did provide a lot of employment in the Philippines. One of the reasons they were unpopular is there was this sense of some sort of entitlement to the American First Forces that was not easy for the Filipinos to accept, nor was it easy for Japanese, Koreans, and others to accept. It's always a controversial part. But I think that support for a U.S. relationship continued. I think Duterte was personally not particularly friendly to the United States. He wanted to create a closer relationship with China. He failed to pick up on the UN decision on the South China Sea, which was also a mistake. I think it's kind of important to realize that even he finally came around. And again, I think the general public supports what we're doing.
I have a slightly more operational question for both of you, and then I'll look it up. Does the Philippines seek closer military relationships, joint missions and training, rescue at sea and so forth. But other countries beside the United States, as you know, you have Japan, Australia becoming more active, Korea even. And so beyond the bilateral relationship, is there also an effort, particularly on maritime and coastal issues, the Coast Guard and the like? Do you see expansion along with the strengthening of the U.S. Philippine alliance, or is that just window dressing?
Well, basically, I think at the core focus of this one is still the China issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Before we only have an alliance with the U.S., but we also have this relationship with the other countries. But now what we are seeing there in the region is that all the other countries are clamping down because in Southeast Asia alone, there's also problem. The maritime waters of Indonesia and all the other countries in Southeast Asia is also being covered by this 9-line by China. And then, of course, there are other issues aside from security issues, economic and political. I think China also has issues with other countries like Australia in terms of economic, and there's problem with Australia, there's problem with Japan for this China Sea, and then of course with Korea, it's China is much more. I mean, it has a channel with North Korea, and that's basically what binds together these countries. Against, I mean, still China on the center.
Yeah, I think we Americans are at least very pleased that both the Japanese, the Koreans, as well as the Australians and others are increasingly involved in the Philippines, both economically with investment and trade, but also strategically in the sense of various forms of military cooperation, all of which is really, in the final analysis, not aimed at China, but kind of intended to balance off the very aggressive activities the Chinese have carried out. I think the Australians may have already negotiated or are in the process of negotiating something that they're also calling the Visiting Forces Agreement.
Let's call it Hubbard 2.
Yeah. But the Japanese, as they have been, increasingly strategically minded, increasingly expansive in their own sense of military activities, have been cooperating quite a bit with the Philippine military, as have the Koreans, and that's all very positive. Let me back up a little bit and say when we wound up when we achieved the Visiting of Forces Agreement and had the capability of having our personnel enter the Philippines as visitors. I think the first application was really in counterterrorism, actually, in Mindanao, where we utilized the Visiting Forces Agreement to have rotating personnel, military personnel, advising the Philippine military in their efforts against the Islamic extremists in Mindanao, and that even continues to this day in slightly different guise. But that was actually something we rarely did, even under the basis agreement. We did not get involved with the domestic insurgencies. The second thing, of course, we woke up to, and it was the South China Sea and Philippine concerns, principally about the very aggressive Chinese activities in the area, and I think we have responded to that through sort of increasingly direct statements that to the Philippines, our mutual defense treaty does apply to your forces and your personnel in the South China Sea, and we will stand by those commitments. And that was another thing that, let me just briefly say, happened during my time as we negotiated the visiting forces agreement. There's a distinction in our mutual defense treaty between the metropolitan territory of the Philippines, that's defined as, treaty dating back to the Treaty of Paris that ended the Spanish-American War, and the various claims in the South China Sea, and then all of that modified, as you've talked about the Hawaiian Islands, all of that modified by the Law of the Sea Treaty, etc. But we've always, since the 1950s, the United States has recognized the commitment we have to help defend the Philippines should there be an attack on Philippine vessels, aircraft, and other personnel in the Pacific area, as distinct from a kind of a direct approach to Philippine home territory. And sometimes with the Filipinos, we're speaking the same language, but having different meaning of that. We discovered in a meeting with a very important Philippine senator, when we were talking about the VFA, he says, well, you're talking about the Pacific, and what we're concerned about is the South China Sea. And I realized for the first time that from the Philippine perspective, they have a South China Sea coast, or South China Sea coasts, and a Pacific coast. And for us, both sides were in the Pacific. And so another sort of imprint I had was the so-called Hubbard letter, which occurred after a visit of the U.S. Secretary of Defense, in which we made explicit that we consider the South China Sea to be part of the Pacific for purposes of the agreement. And we've been saying that increasingly clearly through the years, beginning with when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State and on through the current thing. So we will fulfill our commitments. So that's kind of the second South China. The third area coming up really is Taiwan.
Yes.
And you referred to our potential use of some areas around Zambales, et cetera, the old area around Subic Bay being useful for watching what the Chinese might do in the Bassa Straits. But if you look at a map, almost everything under China is the South China Sea is Philippines, and as you say, some areas, Batanes and President Marcos's home province of Ilocos Norte, that's it. The neighboring province is very close also. So it's hard to imagine that the Philippines will not be somehow involved in our relationship, will not be called into question, not into question, but called into action. If there is a Chinese attack on Taiwan, and I think that's kind of a new area that we're increasingly called upon to think about.
Yeah. So, questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, Eric La Chica from the U.S.
Eric.
Philippines for Good Governance. Yes, I agree with that. The U.S. is very popular. 80% in polling in the Philippines, bilateral relationship. But with due respect, Ambassador, I object to the word rogue Senate, Philippine Senate.
I shouldn't have said that.
Yes, Senator Salonga was a dear friend of mine.
Okay. Yeah.
I worked closely with the former Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Raul Malacos, and I was privy to the behind-the-scenes discussion. Bottom line here, with respect to the speakers, is that the feelings of our friends, Salonga, in fact, I just finished his memoirs just last month, and he was very candid. The U.S. negotiators were not very supportive of the relationship. They played hardball with the Philippine side. the bottom line, I hope you agree with my analysis, Ambassador. You shortchanged. You know, I think Armitage was the negotiator, correct me, or Armitage.
Armitage.
He bragged to the Foreign Affairs Council in LA, oh, we shortchanged it, you know, in so many words. He said, we could have offered $500 million to the Philippines. And the highest offer was $250 million. Correct me my understanding of history. Ambassador, that's unfair to your, you work with these folks, and to call them rogue, I just look at the definition of rogue. I object to that. They work you.
I withdraw, if you meant, Eric, thank you, I withdraw that that word with some embarrassment. I shouldn't have done that. I think this is off the record. I wouldn't have done it publicly. But I withdraw that whole concept. I also, however, do not share, I guess, your criticism of the American negotiators, which included me. You have to remember, among other things, that right in the middle of our negotiation, the largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century destroyed Clark Air Base and made it unusable for at least a decade after that, and very heavily affected the willingness of our Congress to put up money. We had a package before Pinatubo that would have been more generous, but that was for two major bases. Now I know that rightfully many Filipinos took umbrage that we were somehow shortchanging the Philippines because of the natural disaster that occurred. I think that was a natural response, just as you responded with some umbrage at my word about my phrase. That very much affected our ability to we never, one of the things that affected that relationship, and I think the relationship is different now, is somehow our cooperation during the bases era became portrayed in the Philippines and perhaps to a certain degree in the United States is that we were paying the Philippines rent to have bases in the Philippines that were in our interest and not necessarily in Philippine interest. Of course, that was during the Cold War period. It was a different time. Now, I think whatever we do, I think is more clearly appreciated in being in our common interest.
Yeah. If I may,
So it's briefly, because we are running out of time.
right. Why wasn't there more carrots offered to the Philippine negotiators? If there was not enough, rentals, suppose, why were not no sweeteners added? It was only one vote that the agreement failed. It was Estrada, I think, who was the last one, who became the president later on, because there was no incentives for Turkey was getting $500 million and the Philippines got only $250. Why were no incentives?
I think there were incentives, and again, I stand by the agreement that Armitage negotiated. I don't think we could have done better. I don't know as much about the Turkish situation, but again, I think you have to go back to the Pinatubo effect. And I think what we tried to do, Eric, separately from the basis negotiation, was to help you as much as we could in dealing with Pinatubo. That was a kind of a separate issue and set of issues. And because I was based there in the Philippines, I know exactly how Filipinos reacted to that situation. I think we did the best we could.
Okay, time for your question, yes.
Stanley Kober. I'd like to probe this issue of credibility. Ever since I was a college student during the Vietnam War, I've heard about credibility. If we don't defend Vietnam, CETO treaty, we're going to lose our credibility. Well, we lost the war. CETO no longer exists. but we still have credibility. Afghanistan, lost the war. We still have credibility. What, given this track record, I'm really curious, why do you have so much confidence in American credibility?
That's Mr. Acosta first. Why do you?
Well, I think the question was you.
Why do you believe us?
Why?
On the credibility of the US.
Credibility, yes.
Yeah.
Well, at the present situation right now, where are we going? I mean, with the Philippines, I mean, as I said, currently we're being beset by internal and external challenges. And both challenges, the US has always them. I mean, there's problem with the US. I mean, if there's criticism with the US, right now this is the only ally that we have. I mean, it's helping us. So, where should we go? I mean, if you look at the credibility, can we, I mean, in our present situation right now, can we translate that credibility, I mean, within this security situation that we're facing right now? It's going to help us also. I mean, are we just going, I think you're pointing out that during the term of Duterte, he tries to tell the Philippines to China because probably he's going to, I mean, partly the problem in the South China Sea or in the West Philippine Sea will be avoided or will at least be lessened. But I'll tell you, I'll think I'll have a note that during the time of Duterte, we have, this is according to the Philippine Senate, this is according to the hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that during the time of Duterte, there were 388 diplomatic protests that were filed by the Philippines. During the time of Marcos, as of August this year, this is only from June to August, it's 172 protests already. So what are we going to do? I mean, there's a claim, and the other guys pushing this claim very aggressively. So what are you going to do? We cannot fend it, probably. We cannot fend it. The first thing that they did is over the West Philippine Sea and the Kalayaan Island Group. They are already there because no less than our president already said that China is already in control of that part of territory. And if you're going to look at the 9 dash lines of China, it creeps 64 kilometers from the shoreline of Palawan, from the town of Palawan, from the town of Balaba, and then 40 kilometers from Batanes, and then 70 kilometers from a town in the home province of our president right now. So what are you going to do? I mean, if they occupy the West Philippine Sea and Kalayaan Island Group because of that claims, what will prevent China from occupying or from creeping further again within these territories? We could not, because we do not have we don't have the means to fend this off. So what choices do we have? I mean, are we going to look at just credibility?
I would add just quickly that it seems to me there's a difference between undertaking a mission that was unwise and couldn't succeed militarily or otherwise on the one hand, and on the other hand, explicitly rejecting or tearing up an agreement. And in that category, I think the President Trump's decision to tear up the Trans-Pacific Partnership and withdraw from that and withdraw from the climate change and so on. If I were North Korea, I'd say, why should I strike a deal with the United States? They might just walk away again. So there's different aspects of credibility here. I shouldn't be commenting on a moderator. We have time for one more question, I think. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Nasirudi. I'm Asian Studies Visiting Fellow here at Eastern Center, Washington. So I have a very quick 1 or 2 questions. Number one, you discussed about the potential dangers of abrogating this kind of agreement. And I believe that the Philippine government definitely analyzed this kind of potential threats. So if it is the case, what were the motivations? Was it only left political parties' pressures or young Filipinos' pressure? I'm interested to know why did the Philippine government abrogate this agreement? Second one, I'm interested to know what's
Excuse me,
the,
can you just clarify what you just said a little more specifically?
there's the first questions we
Yeah.
are interested to know, because when you was presenting, you were presenting the potential threats and dangers of abrogating this agreement.
Yeah.
And I hope that the Philippine government definitely analyzed this kind of potential threat. And I'm interested to know what were the motivations, what were the reasons of abrogating this agreement? Was it only left political parties' pressures,
Was it just
or
the left
young
that
Filipinos'
opposed
pressure,
VSA?
or the public sentiments?
Or was
That's
the
the
public,
question.
did the public
This-
also object to the VSA?
Yeah.
So you just asked me for
The
clarification.
second one I'm interested to know,
Yeah.
what was the reaction from other ASEAN countries?
Yes,
Yeah, very
he's
good.
asking about the reactions also of the public. I think there's a little bit of opposition to this BFA, but basically, as I said a while ago, it basically comes from the left-leaning groups, right? And then when it comes to the majority of Filipinos, there's a consensus that they welcome this agreement. It's basically the president or former President Duterte who moves to scuttle this because it's because of his close relationship with China. So that's the only primary reason that compels the move to terminate this agreement. But for groups and for other sectors opposing this agreement, the only sectors that's against with this agreement for now is those left-leaning groups identified with post-oriented groups. So that's the only, because they see also the importance of this agreement right now in the middle because of this problem in the South China Sea. If you look at it, it's not only a question of security, because as China is already in those areas, they also prevent Filipinos from fishing those territories. If you have been following those developments in the Philippines, they even attack fishermen. So there are lots of fishermen from Luzon, from northern Luzon and in Palawan, who has been fishing or living by conducting their fishing activities in those areas. They've been sustaining their lives and their families for how many centuries, for how many decades. And now that China is there, China has enclosed those areas and guarded them and prevented Filipinos from fishing in those areas. So if they can prevent, it's not only those fishermen that are being prevented, even the military, even the Philippine military, those the supplies that are regularly being conducted by the Philippine military, they were being even prevented. I think during the time that this BFA agreement is hanging in the balance, there was a time that Chinese vessels even attacked a Philippine Navy resupply. And then last June, immediately after our current president has taken his oath, they again frustrated one of the resupplies in one of those territories that's being occupied by the Philippines.
We're out of time, but could you comment quickly on his second question, which is what is the reaction of other Southeast Asian countries to VFA, or more generally?
To this cancellation of agreement.
To the danger of abrogating the VFA, what is the reaction of other
I think
Southeast Asians?
the neighbors in Southeast Asia also welcomes this visiting forces agreement. I mean, which calls for the forward presence of U.S. forces in the Philippines. Because if they're not there in the region, who's going to police the region, right? As you have seen, anything that goes or travels within the South China Sea, because the strategy here of China is to police or truncate or block the South China Sea. And it's not only Southeast Asia that's favoring the visiting forces agreement, the presence of the Americans there, because every trade, every passes through this body of water. So if this is prevented, it will also affect other countries. I mean, around the world. Just remember, it's trillions of dollars worth of trade that passes there annually.
Exactly. Good. Well, thank you very much. We could go on for quite a long time. I hope you all join me in thanking our two presenters here. at least take part in the future in events of this
Thank
kind.
you, thank you.